Shabbat Shalom. Welcome. So delighted to have you with us. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein. This is Valley Beth Shalom Torah study for a Shabbos morning. I'm joined this morning by my dear friends and teachers, Rabbi Sherre Hirsch of the American University and Rabbi Marc Gellman. Rabbi Gellman is having some trouble with his video this morning. So much like the Lord himself, we're going to hear the voice, but we will not be able to see the face and live. So welcome to both of you. So glad you're here with us today. The world has been so difficult this last week and so tumultuous, and I'm sure there's much that we could say to comment on the events of this past week. But I also think that many of us would like to stick with Torah this morning and to enjoy some of the wisdom, the insights, and the eternal truth of Torah. So we'll get to some comments about contemporary events at the end of our conversation. But this morning we begin a new Torah portion, the Torah portion of Shemot. So Genesis ends last week, and it's the last glimpse at the family. It's Jacob and his children gathered around the deathbed of Jacob as Jacob offers blessings to his family, and then the death of that generation. And this week we begin with something brand new. That family has grown into a great people, fulfilling the promise that God made to Abraham, but ironically not in the land that God gave to Abraham. Ironically, it's in Egypt. And of course, that inspires, that provokes a fear on the part of the Pharaoh, who must respond. And he is so afraid of this people and says to his people, "Hava nidchach malo," let's be wise about this. And then every move he makes is the wrong move. How he enslaves this people to try to delimit its fertility, how he tries to get the midwives to be complicit in the murder of children, how he tries to crush the spirits of this people, and instead they rise and they fight back. And that's what the story is about. And the story gives us three remarkable characters. And this morning, I'm going to ask our friends here to talk about the development of these three characters, of Moses, of Pharaoh, and of the God of Israel. So good morning, Sherre. Good morning, Marc. Nice to have you here today.
Nice
Good morning, good Shabbos.
Let's begin with Moses. Let's talk about how Moses is raised, how Moses becomes Moses. Sherre, how does Moses become Moses?
So I've read this chapter 1,000 times, if not more. And this year I saw it totally different, which is what the power of Torah is. Because a few years ago, we took in a child and became foster parents, as you know, Eddie. And for the first time when I was reading it this year, I read Moses being raised by adopted parents, right? He was raised by Pharaoh's daughter. And that was he wasn't raised by his mother. And what we hear at the beginning of the chapter is his birth, sent down the river. And the next thing we know, he's a young adult. We miss his entire childhood of what it means to be raised by someone other than your biological parent, and how that affects your identity and who you become in the world. And I think it's a very telling motif that the Torah starts with that. He wasn't raised by his mother. And when we start to think about the ways we redefine family, and he was weaned by his mother, right? But he was raised by the Pharaoh's daughter. When we start to think about what are different notions of family, it really makes me think that we need one person to unconditionally love us, and that who basically is in our corner, who's our cheerleader, who has our back. And that's the definition of family. So I think I want to start by saying, like, wow, the Torah throws this curveball that I never saw until I had a different lens. You're on mute, my friend.
Marc, what happens to Moses to make Moses Moses?
Well, it begins with this unanswerable question. The Parsha has several truly unanswerable questions. Later in 424, that God tries to kill Moses on his way back to Egypt. Impossible to understand that. But up here, at the beginning of the journey, we have the question of how Moses knew he was Jewish. And Sherry's initial comments bring that to light beautifully, which is, if he was weaned by his mother, it was certainly weaned by his mother, the Torah says so, but if she disappeared from his life completely, and he had therefore no knowledge of her, then the passage that Moses went out to see his brothers in the field, and the surface seems inexplicable. How did he know they were his brothers? Unless the Torah is saying, we know that they were his brothers, but Moses didn't know. And his action on behalf of the slave was not an action on behalf of the Jewish people. It was an action on behalf of oppressed people. And it was because perhaps that Moses was able to act on behalf of a human being, regardless of their religion or identity or ethnic identity, that God chose Moses in the first place. So it's entirely possible that Moses didn't know that he was Jewish even when he killed the taskmaster. And it wasn't until later that by the people identifying him. The other possibility is that after he was weaned, his mother did stay in connection with him. And therefore there was an understanding that he was Jewish. The other possibility is, of course, that he was circumcised, and Egyptians are not circumcised until later in life, and therefore he certainly would have learned that way. But there's this great mystery of how he understood these were his people.
I want to look at it slightly differently. I certainly appreciate that mystery. See, the book and the parsha are called Shmot, because the second word is Ve'elu Shmot B'nai Yisrael. These are the names of the children of Jacob who went down into Egypt. But the Shmot, I think, is really what this is all about. Shmot means names. It means identity. The question that this book is going to ask is, what makes us Jewish? Is Jewish simply your genetic family, ethnic origin? You were born into the Jacob family? Or is there something else to Jewish? Is there covenant, morality, conscience, a way of looking at the world? And I think the way of looking at the world is exactly what this Torah portion is about. In the second chapter of the book of Exodus, the Hebrew root ro'eh, resh aleph hey, which means to see, occurs 11 times in one chapter. First, we get the birth mother, and it says she sees vaterek oto ki tovhu. She sees ki tov. She sees that he's a nice kid. Right? Now, what mother doesn't think that her baby is the most beautiful baby in the world, right? What if she had seen that he was a miskite, she would have thrown him to the Nile? I mean, come on, of course. But kitov doesn't mean that he was cute, that he was Gerber baby box cute. Kitov means he has something in him. And then it's the adoptive mother. She also sees, right? The baby's floating down the Nile in a basket, and she's the only one who sees him. And then it says she picks up the basket and she has to take off the top, and she sees him and she sees that he's a baby, and she's not afraid of him. He's not an alien. He's not a monster like her father was telling everyone. He's a baby, and she has rahmanis on him. She falls in love with this kid. She pities this kid. I think that Moses grows up with magical eyes. He can see human suffering where nobody else can see it. And the scene that Marc is alluding to is a wonderful scene. Marc says he doesn't respond because the guy's Jewish. I agree with you. I think as he sees human suffering in front of him, and he looks this way and that, and what he's looking for is not that he can get away with it, but he's looking to see if anybody else is going to stop. Is anybody else going to stop and respond to a situation in which a human life is being taken, a human being is being beaten to death? And when he realizes that nobody else is going to stop, he has to make a decision. Are you going to do something? And here we have, I think, the Torah's attempt to try to give us a functional definition of Jewishness. You have eyes to see the suffering of the world, and you have an impulse to do something about it. And the question is, what are you going to do? And that is how the Torah is going to define who we are. Sherre, go ahead.
Eddie, I think that's a beautiful reading, except I would say that every Christian preacher would say the same thing, right?
Amen. Amen.
Give me an amen.
Then they're right.
Right? Because I think anybody from a religious, spiritual system would say that the goal of being religious is to see human suffering and want to do something about it. So I don't think that's uniquely Jewish, as Marc's referring to Moses. It's uniquely human, or what makes us a God-driven person. And as Marc will talk about, God is a big player in this story. And maybe it's the first question of what makes you a theological human? What makes you a caring or a compassionate human? Which I think doesn't make you Jewish, it makes you human.
Right. The way I would say it is this: in a philosophical sense, the beginning is natural law. What Moses is responding to is the suffering of a human being. And that is not Jewish, it's not Christian, it's human. It's a natural law. And that's the first level of being Jewish, is that we must understand that morality, fundamental morality, is not Jewish. It's part of being Jewish, but it's also part of being human. And that's what links us to all people. The second part is what makes us Jewish. And that's the bush, the burning bush. And that is, in addition to natural law, meaning in addition to our understanding that morality is universal, and you don't need even revelation to respond to morality. The second part is our immediate experience of God in our life. And that is the experience at the bush. And that is where God says to Moses, look, you don't really have parents. I will be your parent. You don't really have someone who has your back all the time. I will have your back. You don't have someone who will watch over for you and guide you. I will watch over you and guide you. And I will be your God. And furthermore, that relationship that I have with you, I also had with your ancestors, and they were Jews. And that makes you Jewish. And that makes you part of the covenant. And so I think there's these two levels. First, universal morality. And second, a personal experience of God in your life. And that bush experience occurs for every religious person, every religious Jew, every religious Christian, every religious Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, everyone. It means until we feel touched by the presence of God in some way in our life, we are not really religious. We're part of a people, we're part of an ethnic group, yes. Part of a nation, yes. But we're not connected to God. We don't have a faith. And then something happens at the bush, and all of a sudden, our life is different forever.
So what happened at the bush? Let's talk about that a second. Moshe stands in front of that bush, and he says to God, I'm going to show up in front of the Israelites, and they're going to ask me, what's your name? So what's your name? And God says to him, don't ask me what my name is. Or he actually says to him, my name is Ehyeh, which literally means I will be. And then it says, tell him Ehyeh asher Ehyeh. I will be what I will be. What kind of name is that? I mean, why can't he give him a name? What does it mean to say God's name is Ehyeh? I want to understand the phenomenology of the bush for a moment. What is God saying to Moshe about the nature of divinity and the nature of human relationship with the divine if he can't give him anything more than Ehyeh asher Ehyeh? How do you read that, Marc?
I read it that in the way it seems on its surface, that God changes, and that the revelation that God gives to us as Jews and to all people, the revelation that God gave to Christians, the revelation God gives to Muslims, all of these revelations and all change through time. And the revelation God gives to Jews, to us, changed through time. Now, why is that? It's because we have freedom. And because we have freedom, we make choices that God doesn't know about. It's the only limitation on God's power that is serious and everlasting and self-imposed. God limits God's power to know what we will do next. And the reason for that is that without limiting God's power, if God knew what we would do next, then we wouldn't really be free. The rabbis couldn't figure this out. Leibniz could. It's quite simple. If we are not free, we are not human. If we are free, God won't know what we do. And that's why God cannot have a single name. Because as we change in our relationship to God, God changes in God's relationship to us. And that's why the names change. And what he's saying to Moses is, as you change, as you grow, as your theological sophistication grows, as your understanding of me grows, my name will grow and change as well.
Sherre, what did Moshe discover at that bush?
Look, what Marc's saying is God is in process. And as we uncover and discover God, God uncovers and discovers us. That is a beautiful notion of a God that's constantly evolving and learning with us. And I like that notion because it lets me know that God doesn't always have it right, that God's figuring it out and muddling through just like we are. What I think is so profound about Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I will be that what I will be, or I am what I am, is I think it's a messaging to Moses. You have to be you and try and not be anyone else. I mean, there's a great Talmudic story about this. You know, when you reach the pearly gates, God's going to ask you, were you the best you could have been, right? And God's not going to ask you if you were Gandhi or Mother Teresa or Arnold Schwarzenegger or anything else, right? God's going to want to know if you were you. And I think this Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I think Moses was thinking God's going to be like, my name is George, tell them George sent you. And God's saying, Moses, you know, you be you figure out you, and you go and you be yourself with these people and lead them, and I will be with you and I will figure it out. And as long as I am me. And I think it's a very profound message of grabbing yourself, really like holding on to who you are and believing that's enough in the world.
I love that's very nice. I have it slightly different. Joseph Campbell's one of my favorite scholars, once made an observation. He wrote a beautiful piece after them landing on the moon in 1969. He said, you know, there was a time when we human beings imagined that the gods lived on the top of the mountain. And then somebody climbed the mountain and didn't find any gods up there. So we pushed the gods into the heavens, and somebody went up into the heavens, you know, ascended into the heavens and didn't find any gods there. And then we thought God was farther out, and we kept going farther looking for the gods that we had located there. That's the human process. If I imagine God as anything, as any particular aspiration or a reflection of any particular reality, then it limits me. But a God who can't be limited, a God who can't be held on to, is a God that forces me to continue to grow. This is the God of endless opportunities and possibilities. Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh means the possibilities keep receding in front of you. Keep moving on the journey. Sherre, you have kids living at home. God help you. And you know, and when my kids lived at home, Marc knows this as well, that, you know, you have an idea of who you want your kid to be. And becoming a parent is the dynamic between who you want the kid to be and how the kid exceeds your expectations and sometimes disappoints you. And you have to give up that idea of the kid being, you know, like the worst thing you can say to your kid is, how come you can't be like your cousin Moshe? You know, because that delimits the kid. It doesn't let him have the possibilities of becoming. I love this idea that a God you can't define, a name you can't pronounce, a God whose image keeps receding from us because we have to keep growing and invites us to keep growing. The God of endless possibilities. That's the God that I think saying to Moshe. And remember, it's the opposite of that is the Egypt he came from, in which you were surrounded by the statues of the gods, by the Pharaoh who was a god. All around you were these finite images of what gods are and how it's not you, and you can never be that. Here is a God that invites you to possibilities. So let's take one more moment now. We've talked about a little bit about God and a little bit about Moshe in this story. The third interesting character is Pharaoh. Now, we have a midrash that everybody knows, that the movie, the Ten Commandments. And in the Ten Commandments, the Pharaoh is played by Yul Brynner. And I love Yul Brynner. I mean, Yul Brynner, who is tall and bald and never wears an undershirt, has that wonderful physique, and speaks with that wonderful accent. And no matter what part he's playing, he's always the king and I, as far as I'm concerned. Even in the Magnificent Seven, when he was riding in the Old West on a horse, he was still the king and I, right? And Yul Brynner represents a certain kind of in-your-face evil, an evil which is arrogant, an evil which is overwhelmingly powerful. And God has to defeat this arrogance. But is that really the evil of Pharaoh? Are there other ways to read the evil of Pharaoh? Marc, Pharaoh? Tell me who Pharaoh is.
Well, Pharaoh.
Who would you cast in the movie? That's the first question.
Pharaoh is the consequence, philosophically, of freedom of the will gone awry. So the question is radical evil possible? And Aristotle deals with this question. And the question is, are all the bad things we do just mistakes? We thought we were doing a good thing, but it turns out we were stupid and it wasn't a good thing. Or is it possible for us to will evil? And the answer in Pharaoh and the answer from God, and I would add the answer from Hitler, is that it is possible to will evil. The great Jesuit philosopher Frederick Copleston, in his History of Philosophy, said the Holocaust shows that Aristotle was wrong and that radical evil is possible. And so what we learn from Pharaoh at this very beginning is what happens when the will is connected to an evil idea. And that what I mean by that is, if you are a slave owner, the most irrational thing you can do is kill your slaves. It's like if you were a rancher, the most irrational thing you could do is kill your cows. Doesn't make any sense. So for him to kill Jews, to limit Jews who were the source of his wealth, because they're dying of overwork and everything, the more of them you have, the richer you are, made no sense. Just like it made no sense for Hitler to kill all the Jews of Europe. And his generals told him that. If you do that, we're going to be defeated at Stalingrad and we're going to be defeated in the war. He said, I don't care. I want to kill all the Jews. And Pharaoh said the same thing. And that's what the hardening of the heart, which we'll encounter later, is about. It means at a certain point where you abuse your free will and direct it toward evil ends, you are no longer capable of choosing the good. And that's who Pharaoh is. He's a man who has made himself incapable of choosing the good, which means he's incapable of repentance, which he never does. He never repents. He'll say at the end, okay, get out of here, go. But he never says, I'm sorry for what I did to my people. That is arrogance. That is narcissism. You see it in certain leaders who just don't understand it. But that's what we learned from Pharaoh at the very beginning. His efforts to kill Jews was irrational, and it was evil. It was radically evil. This is a different kind of character in the Torah.
Sherre, who's Pharaoh?
So Marc, that's very interesting what you just said. I see Pharaoh very differently. Egypt is described as Mitzrayim, the narrows. And I see this as a very narrow thinking, very immediate, because it makes no sense, his actions, like you explained so beautifully, right? So he's a very small, narrow-minded, not expansive thinker, very threatened by others, all about scarcity, not about abundance, right? He's a very fearful, small man. So it's funny to me that I don't see it as a Yul Brynner. I see it as like this little tiny guy who's got so much insecurities and narrowness and rigidity, that he can't tolerate anybody seeming to be thriving, which is also, I mean, with all due respect, I see, maybe you don't agree with the image, but I see Hitler as a very similar personality, very broken, very narrow, very limited, you know.
Well, that's the essence of radical evil, Sherre.
Right. That's why I'm agreeing with you, Marc. I feel like what you just said is.
Oh, I thought you said you saw it differently. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I meant I see it, the image of Yul Brynner I see differently, but not the image of evil.
Yeah.
So who would you cast in your movie? Marc would cast somebody willful. Okay. Who would you cast?
Well, I'm not very good at casting. That's for sure. That's not a skill of mine.
It's Hollywood. Come on, you're
I
a
know, but
Hollywood
it's not
rabbi.
something- I never can think of actors in the right places, but I do think of someone very, for lack of a better word, nebbishy and small, that has small-mindedness.
Okay,
So
good.
I don't want to put an actor on that because it would be an insult.
No, you see, because choosing an actor for a role, because the physiognomy, the physical appearance of the actor projects a certain kind of character. Yul Brynner is this in-your-face, powerful evil, and you're suggesting something different. You're suggesting a small man on a big throne that he knows he doesn't belong on, and all of his actions are trying to deflect from that and to project an image of strength which he really doesn't have. He doesn't own it.
Right, because he knows he's a fraud.
Yeah.
He knows he's a fraud. And because of that, everything he does is to protect that image that if you really knew me, you would know that I'm a fraud, is what he's saying.
It's very interesting. So there's, I'll give you just one other. I really enjoy these two reflections on Pharaoh. There's the Hasidic tradition insisted that everything we read in the Torah is really a story of the inner life. So in the writings of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, there is a midrash on the story in which he says, Mitzrayim, as you said, comes from Mitzrayim is Egypt in Hebrew. Mitzrayim comes from the Hebrew word tsar, meaning the narrow place. So the Rebbe asks, how do you get into that narrow place? And he says, well, there's a king called Pharaoh. And he takes the letters of the Hebrew word Pharaoh, it's Pei Resh Ayin Hey, and it comes from the root parua, which means wild. And he says, Pharaoh is the imagination. It's the ego, really. It's the need of the ego to be felt and the need of the imagination to be fulfilled. And it's the ego projecting all of its needs into the world. I need to be worshiped. I need to be revered. I need to be respected. I need to be loved. I need. It's the open mouth of the infant. And there's so much need that he schleps us into his drama of the narrows. And he says, all of us have this inside of us. All of us have a voice of this saying, you know, come and love me and respect me and admire me. And all of us have this. And when we listen to the voice of Pharaoh, we end up in the narrow place. As Sherre said, we're unable to be generous. We're unable to give. We're unable to find God in that place because the voice of our own need drowns out the voice of God in the world. And
yeah,
so
you know, I completely agree with that. I just, in my weekly column, just wrote some New Year's resolutions and shared with my readers, and they shared with me wonderful resolutions they had made. And one of my resolutions, which has been for many years now, is to always give to beggars. And there are people who oppose that. They think, oh yeah, they got a Rolls Royce around the corner, and they're all really rich, but they're beggars to get all your money, or they're drug addicts, and you're just enabling them in their addiction. My argument is this argument that you made, that we have a chance to keep our hearts soft. We have a chance to keep our compassion alive, or we have an opportunity to choose to harden our own hearts, to become on the road to radical evil, but not, of course, that far. And every time we pass someone who might be in need, and we harden our heart to them by not giving them $1, which means, let's face it, nothing to us, nothing. And every time we pass them, our heart hardens a little. So by giving to beggars, we have an opportunity to keep our heart soft and to keep our soul open to the possibility of gratitude and compassion in a wounded world.
Nice sermon. Very well.
I was
Well,
gonna say,
Wait, let me write that down. Let me write that
I
down.
think you
Oh,
was
wait,
really
I'm
good.
retired. It doesn't matter.
No.
I want to add one thing, Eddie, before we close, which is there's a beautiful foil between Moses and Pharaoh, where Moses has all this humility and fear about his potential for leadership, and Pharaoh doesn't have that ability to articulate it. And I think it's telling us very much about leadership. Everybody holds the fear. It's just what capacity are you able to be honest with yourself, and what do you do with that fear? Do you use that to promote evil, or do you use that to promote leadership in a positive way? And so I think they're definitely a foil to one another.
And I would just add, I mean, to me, the opposite of spirituality is to walk the world, as you said, with this ethic of scarcity, and to see the world as a zero-sum game. That for me to win, you have to lose. And that if I see you prospering, it means I'm diminished. And that attitude, which I think is Pharaoh's attitude, instead of seeing the Hebrews as a boon to his community, as a gift to him as a king, he sees them as a threat. And to see anyone else's prosperity as a threat to my well-being is such a poisonous attitude. It's just a poisonous attitude. And it brings us to a slavery, because once you get into that, you become the slave in a very interesting way. As the story goes on, you begin to understand that it's Pharaoh who's the slave. He's a slave to his own policy. He's a slave to his own ego. He's a slave to his own arrogance. And it's, as Marc said, it's going to destroy him. At a certain point, as the plagues begin, the generals come to him and ministers come to him and they say, "What are you doing? This is the end of us. Give it in, give in." And he won't give in because he becomes the slave. And that's the tragic moment in the real destruction of this character, as we'll be describing it in the weeks to come. I know this was a very difficult week, and we all looked at it with trepidation, and we don't have time to give an analysis, but I'm going to ask you for one line each. And I think each of us needs, give me a one-line prayer for the United States of America. Marc, if you're praying for something for America today, what are you praying for?
2 words in Latin, Onward Keptus. It means it's on the Great Seal. It's one of the 2 mottos on the Great Seal of the United States. The other is Novus Ordo Secularum, a new order of things. And I learned it in my Latin classes. And I saw it again in the best photograph from yesterday's horrid situation that broke my heart, was one of the invaders of the Capitol hanging by his arm from the House chamber balcony, and behind him, engraved in the frieze there, is the Latin phrase "Onward Keptus," and I just smiled as I was crying, really, because it means, may God approve our undertaking. And there are 2 visions of our undertaking. One, almost a 300-year experiment of democracy in which our undertaking treats everyone with equal stature under the law. And the other, in which, as you wonderfully stated, this country is, in the language of Hobbes, a war of each against all, a war of each against all, and that we are homo hominis lupus, each person is the wolf of his neighbor. Those are the 2 visions, one in which we are equal and free and we protect each other, and the other is that we are the enemy of our neighbor. And yesterday put that in the most stark relief. And I pray that God will approve our undertaking, and it will be the undertaking of freedom, not the undertaking of hatred and division.
Sherre, a word of prayer for the country this Shabbos.
Simply, I pray for people to be less sure of their rightness.
Yeah. And I would use the language of the Torah portion. Moses has these wonderful eyes, and it says he goes out and he sees an Egyptian man beating a Hebrew man. And then the Torah adds one more line, one more word at the end of that line. It says, Me Echav, one of his brethren, one of his brothers. And the question is, who is Me Echav? Is it that Moses identifies with the victim and that's what moves him to action? Is it that Moses identifies with the slave master, with the Egyptian, who was, after all, who Moses was, and says, this can't be who we are? Or is it the deepest one, which is what Moses sees, is that the Egyptian can't see that the Hebrew is his brother? And the only prayer we make is that we should open our eyes and see that we belong to each other, and that the beautiful words of the sacred document that launched this experiment, we the people. Let's just remember that. We wish you a good Shabbos. Thank you for joining us this Torah morning, this Torah portion. Shabbos davening follows. Have a wonderful Shabbat. Shabbat shalom.